After a year of considering 3 unique proposals to land humans on the moon, NASA has made their decision, and a shocking one at that. NASA chose SpaceX's lunar Starship as the only lander for the Option A round. We'll break down what this all means later. But first, the elephant in the room. My prediction from my HLS video.
If NASA only thinks it has enough money to fund one lander, there is a 0% chance SpaceX gets the contract.
We'll talk about why I think this prediction didn't age so well. Now, of course, in my defense, I didn't have all the information that NASA had. And boy, was that some critical information. In their source selection document, we learned some crucial stuff, like this is no longer the most expensive lander, and this lander literally cannot land. That is not an exaggeration, stick around. So here's what I want to go over today. What new information we learned about all the landers from NASA's source selection statement. Why NASA chose SpaceX. My thoughts on NASA's plan for more funding. Some near-term implications this choice has for the space world. And then I'll wrap it all up with some of my final thoughts. Let's start with Blue Origin's National Team Lander, the ILS. The ILS went from being the most expensive option to cheaper than Dynetics. Now, this is a lot of movement on price because there was $5 billion between these two last we heard. All the bidders got to re-propose their contracts with NASA, and I mentioned in my last video that National Team probably found a way to magically shave a few $1 billion off their asking price, but it's also likely that Dynetics increased their price because NASA said, quote, it was significantly higher than Blue Origin's. We also learned the exact payload capability of the lander. While it is landing crew, it can take down 850 kilograms of payload to the surface, which does meet NASA's requirements. A strength of this lander that NASA noted was the abort capabilities on descent due to the multi-stage design, which provided a lot of redundancy during the landing phase. The vehicle could split apart, and the ascent stage could get astronauts safely back to Orion, even if it lost an engine. The next group of things we learned, I would categorize in the interesting department. The ILS lander used 6 communication links to stay connected to Earth and Orion and all that during the mission. Apparently 4 of those 6 links didn't work, and the 5th probably doesn't work. So this is definitely not good, but stuff like this is solvable. Blue Origin also asked for 2 advanced payments in their proposal. This is a problem because advanced payments were strictly prohibited in the contract request, and technically this disqualified them from getting an award. But it's likely that this was just some oversight by Blue Origin. Basically, it would just need to get ironed out during payment negotiations if NASA did end up choosing their lander. It's not a big deal, but another odd thing worth noting. Next, we learned that National Team had no plan to commercialize their lander, which was a consideration for NASA in selecting these bids. NASA wants these landers, or technology from these landers, to help the company win commercial contracts because that helps fund the landers and it gets more commercial activity in the Artemis program. Think of how NASA and SpaceX developed Crew Dragon, but SpaceX has been able to sell private Dragon launches to Axiom, Space Adventures, Inspiration 4, Tom Cruise movies, and so on. It doesn't come as a huge shock that Blue's landers didn't have many commercial application, considering it's pretty expensive and single use for the most part, but still, NASA didn't like this. Another concern NASA had was that there were some long lead parts in the lander's engines that were considered high risk to schedule by Blue Origin. But Blue Origin didn't give much thought of how to acquire these parts outside of, we'll buy them from a third party. NASA said that decisions like this needed to have already been made by this point to not incur serious schedule risk. I saved the most interesting thing we learned, in my opinion, for last. Now, the landing proposals didn't need to have a sustainable design from the outset, but they did need to demonstrate a reasonable and cost-effective plan to become sustainable. Blue Origin's plan was quite bizarre, frankly. Basically, they would just completely scrap their lander design and re-engineer the entire lander from the ground up. It would have a much larger ascent module to house 4 astronauts instead of 2, and this would also require a much larger descent element made from a completely different construction method. And this complete design overhaul was supposed to be done in like 3 years. Good on NASA for catching this. Artemis is supposed to be about sustainability. Bidding an unsustainable lander is already not great, but to just hand wave the task of ever making it sustainable is very bad. Here's what I really don't understand about this. 2 things. If your lander design is going to evolve into something totally different in just 3 years, 1, what does that tell you about your initial design? And 2, just bid the second one. Why not start with this second version first? It's better and it saves you from having to do the job all over again. Now let's move on to the Dynetics Alpaca. Oh, Alpaca. You were supposed to be the chosen one. The story of Alpaca can be summarized as a fall from grace. In NASA's initial assessment, they received the overall highest grade of all 3 bids. After a year of working with Dynetics and evaluating their proposal further, NASA has given them the lowest score in their selection statement. By far, the biggest revelation from NASA's source selection statement was this: Alpaca is unable to land on the moon at all. This is so unbelievable that I'm just gonna quote from the document directly here. Dynetics' current mass estimate for its DAE, that's descent ascent element, far exceeds its current mass allocation. Plainly stated, Dynetics' proposal evidences a substantial negative mass allocation. Basically, Alpaca is too heavy to land, and apparently way too heavy to land. Not only that, NASA goes on to say Dynetics didn't present any convincing methods to lower their mass, and actually uncovered a lot of areas where the mass would potentially increase during development. This is interesting to me because this whole time Starship seemed like the lander that was too good to be true. But really it was this little guy, the moon lander that literally cannot land. What a twist. Dynetics also didn't give NASA much info on a lot of other elements about the lander, which comes up a lot in their grade. For example, they didn't detail anything about their refueling tankers, and NASA didn't like that. Another thing I found interesting is that NASA stated Dynetics didn't have a feasible method for transferring cryogenic propellant in space, nor a feasible plan to develop such a technology. The reason this is so interesting to me is that Starship, which we'll get to a little later, also transfers cryogenic propellant in space, and a lot more of it. And while NASA cited this as a technological risk for SpaceX, there's no mention of SpaceX not having a method to do it or feasible development path to achieve it, which tells me that SpaceX has a solid plan for propellant transfer and NASA thinks it will work. But back to Alpaca. As if the fact that Dynetics hand-waved a lot of their proposal's technology and bid a lander literally incapable of landing, wasn't bad enough, their price also became the highest out of the three, significantly higher than even Blue Origin. So I guess it kind of goes without saying why they didn't get the award. And finally, we have our winner, SpaceX. I'll go over what we learned about Starship here, and then we'll talk about why NASA chose them. First off, we got a brand new HLS Starship design. The biggest change here is the different landing engine design. Last time we saw Lunar Starship, she had 9 medium-sized engines halfway up the body for the final landing stage. Now it may look like they're gone, but the mid-body landing engines are still there, just much smaller. The HLS Starship will now land using, by my count, 24 tiny thrusters. Personally, I like this change a lot for 2 reasons: safety and development. More engines means a lot more redundancy, and small, cold, or hot gas thrusters, like these appear to be, are simple and reliable. And this many engines will have some incredible engine out capabilities. As for development, we never really knew a lot about the old 9 landing engines. They just seemed to be some notional future engines that SpaceX would have to develop, which is a lot of risk. The new landing thrusters look like they're about the same as a typical Starship maneuvering thruster, so the development is trivial. Some other changes from this photo include a new solar panel placement, which I also like better because it's on a flat part of the vehicle rather than the cone, so it should be easier to mount and launch. The Starship also has new, much beefier Falcon 9 style fold-out legs, which I like because this gives it a much wider stance. Also, this is just me speculating, but these landing engines appear a lot higher up on the vehicle, and so is the crew and cargo access hatch. So there's a possibility that the tanks have actually been stretched in the Lunar Starship as compared to the normal Starship. And we'll also learn 2 new things from NASA's source statement document. First, the HLS Starship will have not 1 but 2 airlocks, complete with their own dedicated life support systems, improving reliability and safety throughout the mission. And last up, we got confirmation of something we expected, which is that SpaceX is paying for more than half of the development cost of their HLS proposal out of their own pocket, which explains the cheap price. Speaking of that price, it did increase from $2.2 billion to $2.9 billion. So why did NASA choose Starship? Well, there's some thought out there that NASA just went with it because it's the cheapest and the only one they could afford. This is not the case, and NASA goes out of its way to dispel this notion in their selection statement many times. SpaceX basically pulled a reverse Dynetics and went from being the lowest rated bid in the initial selection to the highest rated bid in the final selection. A huge positive for Starship that NASA details was what I spoke about in my first HLS video. Starship completely eliminates all volume and mass constraints for Artemis missions. With the Starship lander, you don't need to measure your science payloads by the gram and over-engineer them to be as lightweight as possible. You take whatever you want, no matter how big, heavy, or awkwardly shaped, and you throw it in Starship and take it to the moon. NASA also noted how this provided a huge level of mission flexibility, because the interior can be arranged in a variety of configurations for pressurized, unpressurized, and science cargo. NASA also liked that the Starship doesn't have to evolve over time to become sustainable, it already is. They specifically mentioned that Starship can take 4 crew to the moon immediately without needing base modules to be set up to support the larger crew. If you saw my last video detailing Artemis sustainability, you know how crucial it is to have long stays with a lot of people. If you haven't seen it yet, go check it out. SpaceX gives NASA the capability to bring down more astronauts for longer stays earlier in the Artemis program, which is a huge boost for cost performance. NASA also gave SpaceX high marks for their commercialization plan. Now, this is quite obvious because all of the Starship development goes directly into SpaceX's Starship launch vehicle, which is their next commercial launch vehicle. So that's a lot of the positives. But of course, NASA cited all of the obvious technical risks of the system, such as refueling, high launch cadence, size challenges, advanced Raptor engine problems. But they stated that these risks did not outweigh the rewards of Starship, and furthermore, they believe SpaceX's plan to achieve their goals is possible. Some things that ease their fears include the high pace and extensive testing program for Starship that has been ongoing in Boca Chica, Texas. Another one of NASA's biggest concerns, the refueling of Starship, was also mitigated by SpaceX, with NASA saying SpaceX allayed their concerns by demonstrating flexibility in the timing of its required propellant tanker launches. What this means is Starship doesn't have to launch 12 times in a week to get fueled up, and then if they can't, they have to start the whole mission over. SpaceX demonstrated to NASA that they will be able to build in large time margins to the refueling capability, so that the system can take as long as it needs to get refueled before going out to the moon. NASA also liked that all of the risky refueling maneuvers take place in Earth orbit, not around the moon, and not with astronauts on board. So if problems arise, they are more easily addressable and never risk the crew. Now, this is why my predictions were so far off. I graded Starship as the best of the proposals according to my metrics, but I assumed NASA would have different metrics and would ultimately be so put off by the risk associated with Starship that they wouldn't even deeply consider the positive attributes. I was wrong. NASA graded this vehicle exactly like I did, with a sober understanding of its risks, but really giving merit to Starship's paradigm-shifting capabilities. Here's a quick little example of where my thinking was flawed. NASA required each lander to bring 850 kilograms of payload to the surface of the moon alongside the astronauts. And here's what each lander could bring. Starship could take 100,000 kilograms. The ILS could take 850 kilograms. And the Alpaca could take nothing because it cannot land. Now, when we look at this, it's like, okay, go with Starship. Can you imagine the possibilities? See, I assume NASA would have to look at this and say, SpaceX meets the requirement but has a lot of risk, and Blue Origin meets the requirement but has less risk. As it turns out, NASA did care a lot about this added capability, and I'm glad they did. SpaceX also clearly impressed NASA with their capability to deliver on the risky elements of their proposal. Their management score leaped from acceptable up to the highest possible grade of outstanding over the course of the evaluation period. All of this combined paints a clear picture that SpaceX was the obvious first choice for the award. NASA does mention that if there was funding available, they would have offered an award to national teams second, but more on that later. I believe NASA has a clever plan here for persuading Congress to give them more money for the landing systems. You see, Congress isn't happy that SpaceX is going to be the sole winner of this award, and NASA knows that. A few Congress people have already written letters to NASA complaining about the award, and it's only been a few hours. But you see, Congress gave NASA only $850 million of their requested $3 billion for the landing systems. NASA chose SpaceX, as we said, because it was clearly the best option of the three. It also happened to be the cheapest, making it an obvious choice. They repeatedly say in their selection statement that they would like to have offered an award to national team if they had the funding to do so. So if Congress calls up NASA in a hearing and says, hey, you shouldn't have given this award to SpaceX, we need at least 2 providers, NASA will say, gladly, give me the money and you'll get 2 providers. And they've already hinted at the way they plan on doing this. You see, SpaceX won the contract for Option A of the human landing system. Option A includes the development of the lander and just the first landing of humans back on the moon. They've already announced that they will be competing another HLS competition called Option B. Option B will allow these landers, including SpaceX, National Team, Dynetics, and potentially other contenders, to bid for multiple landings. If NASA can convince Congress to give them more funding, Option B gives them the possibility to on-ramp more landers into the Artemis program, which overall would be awesome to have more landers involved in the program, giving us redundant, dissimilar capabilities. So I really think this is a smart technological and political move by NASA. They get an outstanding lunar lander, but they also ruffle the feathers of Congress in a way that could lead to more money for Artemis. Now, I want to talk about some of the short-term implications this has for the spaceflight world. First up, the spotlight will be on Starship more than ever, and criticism will be through the roof. And a lot of this criticism will be warranted and will make Starship a better vehicle. But we all know that a lot of people don't understand how SpaceX developed things, and especially non-space media knows that explosions, not successes, get clicks. So just get ready for the Elon Musk's Tesla rocket explodes, but there were no people on board headlines. We all know they're coming. But on the bright side, we now live in a world where NASA has thrown its full trust and support behind Starship. NASA has extensively studied Starship for a year and came back with the conclusion that Starship is possible, SpaceX can get the vehicle working, and that SpaceX's price targets are, quote, realistic. So, according to NASA, in the next few years, there will be a fully reusable, super heavy launch vehicle capable of bringing 100 tons to orbit and to the surface of the moon. Wow. What that means is, if you're a person or company out there saying, Starship is just some far-off pipe dream that will never work, you're betting your rocket knowledge against SpaceX and NASA. I'm not sure there's a worse bet you could make. So investors, entrepreneurs, you can start to build and fund your business cases around Starship. And launch providers, get ready because this is your competition. One of my upcoming videos will explore the unique ways each launch provider can adapt to a launch market with Starship in it. So make sure you subscribe if you want to see that. Another thing this allows for is NASA to have some say in the development of the Starship program, which SpaceX was developing in somewhat of a vacuum beforehand. And on SpaceX sides of things, this allows NASA to become more and more comfortable with the Starship system, paving the way for Starship to become more heavily involved in a plethora of NASA programs down the road. So I'm going to close this video out, as I always do, with my final thoughts. I doubted NASA's ambition with Artemis and was wrong. They clearly aren't going to be content with an Apollo 2.0. They are going big. Think of it like this. Before this decade is out, there will be a 50-meter tall rocket with more habitable volume than the International Space Station, standing on the moon's surface with people inside. Just reflect on that. And I'll leave you with a cliffhanger. Using HLS Starship in the current way, as a shuttle from Orion or Gateway down to the lunar surface and back, is the worst way to use the system. And I'll explain why in my next video, how not to use a lunar starship, which will be the first video in an upcoming Starship mini-series where we will cover some interesting topics, such as, is there demand for Starship, the economics of suborbital cargo, and how other commercial launch providers can survive Starship's entrance to the market. So subscribe and hit that bell if you want to see more. Thanks for watching.